Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. Puzzlement and confusion could be seen in Bai Xiaochun's eyes the entire way out of the Rainbow District. The cold female cultivator leading the way suddenly seemed much warmer than before, and even looked at him a few times out of the corner of her eye to size him up. When they reached the teleportation portal, she smiled and gave him a curtsying bow. "Brother Bai, sorry for my lack of manners earlier. Oh, my name is Qing Zan." Then the light of teleportation rose up between them. Bai Xiaochun's vision swam, and the echo of the young woman's words was replaced by the cacophonous din of Sky City. Bai Xiaochun felt almost like he had been dreaming just now. But then he pulled the 7-colored flag out of his bag of holding and looked it over, and his eyes began to shine brightly with excitement. I can't believe he actually gave it to me. The idea of having his own 5-kilometer area of personal property in Sky City was spine-tingling. However, he didn't forget his suspicions about why exactly things had played out as they did. Looking back up in the direction of Sky Quarter Rainbow, he murmured to himself, "Somebody is secretly helping me." The Sky Quarter Peak Lord was obviously being forced to give me a gift. Otherwise, why did he never actually take the pill formula? Lost in thought, he headed back toward the North District. However, his reverie didn't last long. Soon he realized that everyone around him was talking about the Azure Dragon Society. "Did you hear? After you consume that evil fantasy pill, it gives you permanent brain damage." How sadistic. It doesn't just give you brain damage. If you consume enough of them, your latent talent deteriorates, and you slowly go crazy. I even heard of some people who died from them. There's worse. They're addictive. Once you start consuming them, you go crazy if you try to stop. I should have known the Azure Dragon Society would be responsible for a sadistic pill like that. The boss of the Azure Dragon Society was the one who invented it. Hey, do you guys remember the ultra-fasting aid pill? He made that too. What a depraved devil. Bai Xiaochun was not very happy about such talk. Although his fantasy pill wasn't perfect, it definitely wouldn't cause any sort of permanent harm, and the positive aspects of the pill more than made up for any side effects. Furthermore, nobody had ever died from consuming them. However, the rumors were too perfectly crafted, and by the time Bai Xiaochun arrived at the North District, word had spread to the other districts as well. Based on the animosity being voiced toward the Azure Dragon Society and boss Azure Dragon, Bai Xiaochun couldn't help but imagine what would happen if someone recognized him. All it would take would be for someone to shout out and identify him, and everyone around him would surely pounce on him. He was trembling with fear, but in order to play it as safe as possible, he walked through the crowd cursing the Azure Dragon Society as loudly as possible. After hurrying along for some time, he finally arrived at the Azure Dragon Society's headquarters. Upon his return, everyone offered greetings, but clearly, they were very nervous. Seemingly on the verge of tears, Xu Baosai said, "Junior Patriarch, that shameless Celestial Sky Society has been spreading rumors everywhere, slandering the Azure Dragon Society. A lot of our people have already renounced their membership. The situation is completely out of control." Master God Diviner said, a bitter smile on his face. Despite the fact that they had been on guard for a counterattack, the Celestial Sky Society was too big of an organization, and had connections in the city that went far deeper than the Azure Dragon Societies. Big Fatty Zhang and Chen Manyao seemed very anxious, and the other Azure Dragon Society cultivators were all standing there in mute silence. Everyone was obviously waiting to hear what exactly had occurred during Bai Xiaochun's trip to the Rainbow District, and if anything positive had come of it. If the result was indeed positive, then they would stick with the Azure Dragon Society and wait to see how things developed. If not, then they would have to start considering how they would survive after having offended the Celestial Sky Society. Bai Xiaochun was very angry. After all, the Celestial Sky Society had been the group who had started selling the fantasy pills, and those versions had been crafted from stolen hallucination smoke. Now, they were going so far as to pin all the blame on Bai Xiaochun, which was a humiliation that left him fuming. Then he thought back to how he had been set up in the situation with the ultra-fasting aid pill, and his anger reached the point where he almost couldn't contain it. Big Fatty Zhang eyes shone with vicious light as he said, "Ninth Fatty, the Celestial Sky Society has pushed things too far. Let's go have it out with them once and for all." Clearly, his experiences recently had left him with a much sharper killing aura to him. Junior Patriarch, Xu Baosai said, "I think we really do need to just go fight it out with them." "But how are we supposed to do that considering the sect rules?" "There's nothing we can do." Master God Diviner jumped in. "With the fantasy pills outlawed, we have no way to make a living. What are we supposed to do?" All the other cultivators simply stood to the side as the discussion progressed. Finally, one of the orange-robed disciples stepped forward, clasped hands and bowed to Bai Xiaochun. "Boss, did anything good come of your trip to the Rainbow District?" As soon as the words left his mouth, everyone quieted down and looked at Bai Xiaochun expectantly. Bai Xiaochun took a deep breath to suppress his anger, then said, "Of course some good came of it. But we still can't sell fantasy pills." The silence which met his words was even deeper than the silence from before. After looking over the group, he asked for someone to bring him a map of Sky City, then turned and walked into his room. Time passed. The next day, more cultivators left the Azure Dragon Society. The day after that, even more left. That trend continued with each passing day. By the time 7 whole days had passed, the continued pressure from the Celestial Sky Society saw 90% of the cultivators leave the Azure Dragon Society. The Azure Dragon Society had risen with explosive speed, and although such people had been happy to join it at the peak of its success, none of them had any desire to stay with it as it declined. The group's subsidiary organizations in the other districts of the city collapsed, and the smaller clans and gangs that had joined them abandoned them and cut all ties. All sorts of rumors swirled in the city, and the Celestial Sky Society took advantage of the situation to absorb as many former members of the Azure Dragon Society as possible. Soon, the Azure Dragon Society's headquarters was almost completely empty. There were now less than 1,000 cultivators remaining, and after 2 days passed, more left. By the 9th day, they had less than 200 members. The majestic Azure Dragon Society had almost completely fallen in only 9 days. The matter shook all of Sky City, and further reinforced the Celestial Sky Society's reputation of being powerful and having deep resources. In some ways, it was not a big surprise. Everything about the Azure Dragon Society had been based on their incredible income of merit points. Without time to truly settle down, they were like an empty building that could collapse when hit by a single big wave or a single gust of wind. Only a bit more than 100 cultivators stayed behind, and they were either the original members or very sentimental and loyal. This time around, Bai Xiaochun's Dao protectors didn't leave, not even Chen Manyao. They all sat around in the Immortals cave, waiting for Bai Xiaochun's door to open. During the 9 days which passed, Bai Xiaochun didn't rest. Instead, he carefully studied the map of Sky City, poring over every street and alley, studying each aspect in the most minute detail. It was the evening of the 9th day when he finally emerged. His eyes were bloodshot, but he looked excited. Although he was a bit surprised that only a few people remained in the Azure Dragon Society, after a moment of thought, he threw his head back and laughed. When the remaining members of the Azure Dragon Society saw him laughing, their hearts began to thump with hope. Eyes shining with mysterious light, he took a deep breath and then said, "All right, fellow Taoists. Pack your bags. We're moving. The Azure Dragon Society has fallen, but I've thought up a new name which will take us even farther than before." Swishing his sleeve, he said nothing more. However, the rest of the cultivators' moods were instantly lifted. Master God Diviner was the first to start packing his bags, and before long, the entire group of more than 100 cultivators was walking out of the Immortals cave. Their destination was not in the North District, but rather, in the West District. Quite a few cultivators noticed them as they made their way along, and when people realized that they were the Azure Dragon Society, they began to follow curiously. Everyone was wondering where the bedraggled remnants of the organization would go. There were even some people sent by the Celestial Sky Society to follow them. Bai Xiaochun completely ignored them, and it was without the slightest pause that he headed to an area on the very edge of the West District. Shockingly, what existed there was a vast desert. When people realized where he was heading, their jaws dropped in shock. After all, within that desert was a ruined city where cultivators of Sky City would often go to carry out important missions. Not very far into the desert itself were the crumbled ruins of a temple, which was the entrance to a necropolis that stretched out under the surface of the city. The necropolis was huge, almost half the size of Sky City itself. All sorts of rare beasts, immortal grasses, and spirit plants grew there. It was a source of abundant resources for cultivators. The ruins of the necropolis were the only place where disciples could go on missions inside Sky City itself. In fact, many of sect missions required that disciples go there. It was a special place, much safer than locations on the outside. Although it was indeed the ruins of an ancient necropolis, it had been put there by the Starry Sky Tao Polarity sect for the express purpose of allowing disciples to train. There were some creatures and areas in the ruins that certain disciples couldn't easily handle alone, but they were few and far between. Furthermore, Sky City itself was considered to be inside of the Starry Sky Tao Polarity sect, and as such, many disciples preferred to come to this place to go on missions. Because of that, it tended to be a very bustling place. The land itself was extremely valuable, and no one in Sky City other than the Celestial Sky Society was powerful enough to set up shop there. Generally speaking, they let anyone inside, but when people came out, they were required to share 30% of whatever profits they had acquired inside. Either that, or they had to spend a significant amount of merit points to get a special command medallion from the Celestial Sky Society that let them go on their way with no questions asked. Only the Celestial Sky Society, with their Diva clan background, could do such a thing. Many people had thought of trying to take similar advantage of the ruins, but the Celestial Sky Society wouldn't let them. After all, the Celestial Sky Society had paid an enormous price for the right to take control of that location, and the profits they earned made up more than 50% of their total income. With such enormous profit at stake, the Celestial Sky Society obviously viewed the place as being extremely important. As Bai Xiaochun led his group of over 100 people toward the desert, everyone was shocked, including the cultivators from the Celestial Sky Society. What's wrong with this Azure Dragon Society? What do they think they're going to do here? Don't tell me that they want to go into the necropolis ruins to go on some missions. It doesn't look like that's what they're doing. Outside of the ruins was a checkpoint manned by large numbers of Celestial Sky Society cultivators, and as soon as they saw Bai Xiaochun and his followers heading their way, serious expressions appeared on their faces, and they rose to their feet. There was also quite a crowd of cultivators preparing to go into the ruins to go on missions. When they saw the big group approaching, curious expressions appeared on their faces. Nobody said a word. As for the Azure Dragon Society cultivators Bai Xiaochun had brought with him, none of them really understood what was happening, not even Big Fatty Zhang and the other Dao protectors. Finally, Shu Baosai couldn't hold back from asking, "Junior Patriarch, what are we doing here? This is where we're moving to." Bai Xiaochun replied loudly, not even bothering to look back. Instead, he simply kept his eyes fixed ahead as he walked forward, completely ignoring the Celestial Sky Society cultivators. Those cultivators didn't dare to get in Bai Xiaochun's way. Not only was he a gold core cultivator, more importantly, the rules of the Celestial Sky Society stated that anyone could enter the ruins. It was only upon leaving that they had to pay the Celestial Sky Society their share of the loot. Bai Xiaochun passed the Celestial Sky Society cultivators, and then stopped at a point roughly 3,000 meters from the ruins of the temple. After looking around for a moment, he seemed to be quite pleased. "All right," he announced, "this is our new home." Master God Diviner blinked a few times and then glanced around. A blank look could be seen in Shu Baosai's eyes, and Big Fatty Zhang was staring mutely in shock. Even Chen Manyao's jaw had dropped. If they had such a reaction, there was little need to even consider how the other cultivators from the Azure Dragon Society reacted. They simply exchanged blank, awkward stares. When the Celestial Sky Society cultivators heard Bai Xiaochun's words, they immediately burst into loud laughter. "Very amusing. They think they're going to live here or something? This whole area belongs to the Starry Sky Tao Polarity sect, not any individual person. Just what does the Azure Dragon Society think they're going to do?" They weren't the only ones who found it hard to hold back from laughing. The crowd which had followed along, as well as the cultivators who had gathered in preparation of entering the ruins, were all roaring with laughter. "I know the Azure Dragon Society got castigated recently, but don't tell me they're all actually insane? Do they really think they can just settle down in this place?" Boss Azure Dragon is a core formation cultivator, but even he couldn't have taken over this area during the height of his power. This place is the lifeblood of the Celestial Sky Society, and they're backed by a Diva clan. If Azure Dragon Society tries to settle down here, that clan will definitely put them in their place. As the mocking laughter surrounded them, Master God Diviner's face turned red, and Shu Baosai looked very awkward. Furthermore, the embarrassment and confusion in the eyes of the Azure Dragon Society cultivators grew deeper. Big Fatty Zhang and Chen Manyao coughed dryly, and appeared to be hesitating about whether or not to say anything. "Xiaochun." In that moment, Bai Xiaochun stuck his chin up and waved his sleeve, sticking his arm out to reveal what was clasped in his hand, a small, seven-colored flag, shining with dazzling light. Instantly, intense pressure weighed down on the area, and all the laughter ceased. As for Bai Xiaochun, he looked very pleased with himself as he cast the little flag straight down into the ground at his feet. "Activate," he roared. The instant the little flag pierced into the ground, heaven shaking, earth-shattering rumbling filled the air, a sound like the crashing of thunder. "Rumble." Everything began to shake violently as a gale-force wind spiraled out of the little flag, engulfing the entire area and causing even more intense pressure to weigh down. The Tao protectors' faces flickered, and they backed up, gasping. The Celestial Sky Society cultivators, the passers-by, and the cultivators hoping to go on missions all began to edge backward. The pressure weighing down on them seemed like heavenly might, the source of which was the little flag that Bai Xiaochun had just stabbed down into the ground. As the wind screamed and the lands shook, Bai Xiaochun's hair whipped about him, and the 7-colored light swept out, filling a 300-meter area around the flag. However, things weren't over yet. The light continued to spread, and in the blink of an eye, had filled 1.5 kilometers. Then 2.5 kilometers. And finally, 5 kilometers. 7-colored ripples filled that entire area, completely replacing the desert sands which had existed there before. Everything flickered with scintillating light, as well as silence, which was broken only by the gasps of the other cultivators in the area. But then, before any of them could react, the land began to tremble again, and more intense rumbling sounds rose up as the 7-colored ripples slowly merged into the ground. As they vanished, an enormous sealing mark became visible. An enormous, indelible sealing mark. Then, a powerful force of expulsion appeared, a force which no one in the area could possibly fight back against as it wrapped around them and removed them from the 5-kilometer area. Everyone was completely flabbergasted. That was the force of expulsion that the Starry Sky Tao Polarity Sect spell formations create for personal property. That's impossible. How could that be a true force of expulsion? Heavens! Only people who have the approval of the Starry Sky Tao Polarity Sect's grand spell formation can have personal property with a spell formation like that. There aren't even 10 locations in all of Sky City that are personal property. I can't believe Boss Azure Dragon can stake claim to personal property. The surrounding cultivators felt as if lightning were crashing around in their minds, giving rise to shouts of astonishment and disbelief. Even the people from the Azure Dragon Society, including the Tao Protectors, were all struck mute with astonishment. However, most mind-blowingly shocking of all was that the entrance to the necropolis ruins was located within that 5-kilometer area. As the cries of shock rose up, Bai Xiaochun stood there with his hands clasped behind his back and his chin held high. Looking extremely pleased with himself, he said, "Ahem. I'll be setting up a little inn right here, and I already thought of a name for it. It's going to be called the Live Forever Tavern. Everyone, feel free to enter the necropolis just as before. However, since this place is my home, before entering, I request that you enjoy a cup of spirit tea. Once you do, you're considered a friend." Then he cleared his throat, smiled broadly, and continued, "Don't worry, a cup of spirit tea is very cheap. Furthermore, when it comes to the loot from inside the necropolis, I'll charge much less than the Celestial Sky Society did. Only 10%. The people from the Celestial Sky Society felt their hearts surging with shock. Control of the entrance to the ruins had just been viciously wrenched out of their hands. As for all of the other cultivators, their eyes began to shine brightly. The Celestial Sky Society had charged 30%, so obviously, the Azure Dragon Society was doing everything they could to keep the masses happy. As soon as Bai Xiaochun took the 7-colored flag given to him by the Sky Quarter Peak Lord and stabbed it into the ground in that desert, everything in the 5-kilometer area around it became his personal property. The matter instantly caused a major commotion within Sky City. The news spread like wildfire, until everyone in the entire city was talking about the matter in tones of complete shock and disbelief. Personal property? How? How is that even possible? There are less than 10 places in all of Sky City that count as personal property, and they're only given out as rewards for people who perform incredible meritorious service for Sky Quarter Rainbow. The Azure Dragon Society obviously has some powerful backers. That's what I said. Everyone was wondering why the Azure Dragon Society dared to challenge the Celestial Sky Society, and now we know. The boss Azure Dragon is incredibly mysterious and unfathomable. It wouldn't be surprising if he had a diva on his side. Even as word spread in the city, the news was brought to the leadership of the Celestial Sky Society, who reacted with looks of dumbfounded shock. They had worked themselves to the bone fighting against the Azure Dragon Society both physically and in terms of wits. Now, Bai Xiaochun had unleashed a deadly counterstrike. Just when he seemed to have been defeated without possibility of recovery, he turned everything around. The Celestial Sky Society simply couldn't accept the situation. Personal property. Countless cries of shock filled the Celestial Sky Society, and many members were filled with bitterness and hesitation. In the briefest of moments, everyone's opinions of the Azure Dragon Society had completely changed. After all, they now controlled the only entrance into the necropolis ruins. As for everyone who had recently abandoned the Azure Dragon Society, their hearts swelled with regret, and yet, there was nothing they could do about the situation. The Azure Dragon Society wasn't recruiting anymore, and rejected any people who took the initiative to apply for membership. It didn't take long before, there in the desert in the west district of the city, right next to the entrance to the necropolis ruins, a tavern was erected by the over 100 members of the Azure Dragon Society. It was a huge tavern consisting of multiple structures, and even had outdoor seating under numerous tented pavilions. The more than 100 members of the Azure Dragon Society became waiters who specialized in selling spirit tea. People who wanted to enter the necropolis ruins couldn't do so with a Celestial Sky Society command medallion. Instead, they had to buy a cup of tea. It only took a few days to build the tavern, and then it was open for business. Of course, Sky City was a subsidiary of Sky Quarter Rainbow, and yet not a single peep had been heard from there regarding the matter. Apparently, no one up on the rainbow cared about what was happening, and that in and of itself was extremely telling. It also fueled even more speculation regarding the mysterious background of Boss Azure Dragon. Time passed, and the Celestial Sky Society was forced to simply deal with the situation. Soon, the number of people entering the ruins returned to its normal rate, and before long, the fact that the Azure Dragon Society was only collecting 10% of the profits from inside ensured that more and more cultivators chose that location to go on missions. Eventually, more than 100,000 disciples were entering the ruins on a daily basis. Considering the volume of customers, it was little wonder that the Azure Dragon Society was very busy. Soon, the outdoor pavilion seating couldn't accommodate the crowds, and they had to erect even more pavilions. In terms of the merit point profit, when Bai Xiaochun checked into it, he gasped. They were earning so much more profit than when they had been selling fantasy pills that it was simply terrifying. The Celestial Sky Society must be filthy rich, he said, swallowing hard. Next to him, Big Fatty John looked at the merit point reports, his eyes shining as he likewise denounced the Celestial Sky Society. No one personally kept the merit point profits. They were collected in a command medallion belonging to the organization as a whole. That way, the millions of merit points wouldn't accidentally force anyone to rise to the position of a yellow-robed disciple if they didn't want to. In fact, Bai Xiaochun was actually very worried that he one day might accidentally get himself promoted to yellow-robed disciple. If that happened, he would probably cry himself to death. Therefore, he was very careful never to have more than a few 100,000 merit points on his person at any given time. Most of the merit points were stored in the Azure Dragon Society's Joint Command Medallion. A few days passed, and the tavern continued to explode in popularity. As for the Celestial Sky Society, their income dwindled. They had lost the fantasy pills, and they had lost their control of the ruins. After much debate, they finally sent people to try to work out a deal with the Azure Dragon Society. Bai Xiaochun had Master God Diviner and Shu Baosai handle the negotiations. Naturally, the Azure Dragon Society didn't agree to any compromises, and eventually just drove the Celestial Sky Society cultivators away. Bai Xiaochun felt very, very pleased with himself. By now, Sky City truly felt like home, and his share of the merit point profits was very satisfactory. Now this is life, he thought, standing on a balcony in the tavern, looking down at all the hustle and bustle. Even more pleasing to Bai Xiaochun was that because of his recent cultivation progress, he had reached the point of an imminent breakthrough. From what he could tell, it would only be a few days before he reached the mid-gold core stage. Therefore, he set aside external matters and went into secluded meditation in a secret room in the tavern, hoping to achieve that breakthrough as quickly as possible. That session of secluded meditation lasted for a month. At that point, Bai Xiaochun's eyes snapped open, and a bright blue light could be seen in his pupils. At the same time, intense streams of frigid qi were roiling off of him. The frigid qi soon filled the entire area, causing the temperature in the chamber to drop rapidly. Cracking sounds could be heard as ice began to cover the walls, ceiling, and roof. Frigid acolytes can form frigid shadows and unleash the magic of frigid coldness. As for frigid adepts, they can freeze everything in a 3,000-meter area. With that, he waved his hand. Instantly, his hand turned as clear as crystal, making it possible to see the blood flowing through the veins beneath his skin. Apparently, the cold in the chamber didn't affect him at all. Time to break through, he said. Rising to his feet, he sped out of the secret chamber, and before anyone could detect his passage, was gone from the tavern. He became a beam of light, shooting through the air to appear in a location deep in the desert. It was a remote area with no signs of life whatsoever, and definitely no cultivators from Sky City. Few people would ever come to a distant place like this. It was a place that blistered with intense heat. Despite being so close to the Heavenspan River and the Heavenspan Sea, this was still a desert, and the temperature was so high that it distorted the air, making it difficult to see anything clearly. As Bai Xiaochun stood there, the blue light in his eyes grew more intense. After looking around to confirm that there really was no one present, he suddenly closed his eyes, whereupon a blast of intense frigid qi spread out to fill the 300-meter area around him. Instantly, the blazing heat of the desert was completely neutralized, and the ground even froze up. In fact, because of the sudden juxtaposition of hot and cold, thunderous rumbling sounds filled the air. However, things weren't over yet. Bai Xiaochun rotated his cultivation base, and as the power of the frigid school will evolving incantation erupted, he performed a double-handed incantation gesture, causing the 300-meter area of coldness to expand rapidly. Rumble, 600 meters, 900 meters, 1,500 meters. And yet, the process was not over. Bai Xiaochun's hair whipped around him, and although his eyes were closed, it couldn't stop the blue light from spilling past his eyelids and spreading out in all directions. Both of his hands were as translucent as crystal, making it seem almost as if he were made of ice. The area of frigid qi soon reached 2,100 meters, and the cracking sounds continued as the heat of the desert was driven away. Frigid qi erupted, spreading out to 2,700 meters. 2,760 meters. 2,850 meters. 2,940 meters. Within the space of a few breaths of time, the frigid qi had filled an area of 2,997 meters. There were only 3 meters left. 3 meters to the frigid adept level. Frigid adept, Bai Xiaochun roared as his eyes snapped open. Intense rumbling sounds echoed out from his cultivation base as the frigid qi in his Heaven Dao gold core continued to expand. In that moment, the area covered by his frigid qi reached 3,000 meters. The intense coldness within that area was such that the ground was completely iced over, turning the area into a world of freezing ice. In that moment, Bai Xiaochun's Heaven Dao gold core broke through from the early stage to the mid-gold core stage. Simultaneously, a Heaven Dao aura spread out in all directions. Outside of that 3,000-meter area, the desert was just as hot as ever. However, because of the presence of the intense cold right next to it, even the air began to shatter. It was a completely and utterly shocking sight. Bai Xiaochun's eyes overflowed with excitement and then flickered, causing numerous illusory projections to appear within the 3,000-meter area, all of which looked exactly like Bai Xiaochun. These were none other than his frigid shadows. Suddenly, he switched places with one of them. There was no speed involved because it was just like a teleportation. If anyone had been there to see so many versions of Bai Xiaochun, they would definitely have gasped in shock. Moments later, the numerous frigid shadows converged, revealing Bai Xiaochun's true form. Waving his sleeve, he dispelled the area of coldness, allowing the heat to sweep back in. The resulting tempest sent his hair whipping about as he threw his head back and laughed heartily. If anyone had been there to see what was happening, they would have been deeply shaken. This was something that could not be accomplished by ordinary mid-core formation cultivators, or even the top chosen of the generation. Furthermore, this was the river source Starry Sky Dao Polarity sect, whose chosen vastly surpassed those in the lower or middle reaches. And yet, what Bai Xiaochun was currently doing would shock all such chosen. And the might of the frigid school will evolving incantation was only just revealing its potential. This is only the frigid adept level. When I reach the frigid master level. Bai Xiaochun's eyes shone with anticipation as he thought back to the description of the technique. Frigid masters can create a 30,000-meter frigid domain with actual clones. These are just frigid shadows, not true clones. At this point, he couldn't help but think about the frigid paragon level. Frigid paragons can even freeze portions of the Heavenspan River. Bai Xiaochun's hands were clenched into fists, and the anticipation in his eyes shone strong and bright. However, this session of cultivation was not yet over, and his breakthrough wasn't going to be limited to the frigid school will evolving incantation. The time had come for his undying tendons. Next, he looked down at his left leg, the tendons of which had by now been refined to completion, making his leg the strongest part of his entire body by far, and also the most resilient. Eyes glittering, he lifted his left foot up and then stomped it back down toward the ground, fueling the motion with all the power of his undying tendons. Even before the foot actually made contact, the ground began to quake, sending countless volumes of sand flying up into the air. And yet, Bai Xiaochun wasn't satisfied. In the moment that his foot made contact with the ground, his eyes flashed, and he said, "Undying hex." Countless crevices snaked out in all directions, creating something like a natural restrictive spell. In that instant, everything in the area was simultaneously sealed in place and then destroyed. The area around Bai Xiaochun began to collapse, sending massive amounts of dust flying up into the air. Sounds like muffled thunder echoed out in all directions, reaching even the inhabited parts of Sky City. Bai Xiaochun let out a yelp as tumbled downward through the flying dust and sand. Then, moments later, as the dust settled, he could be seen at the bottom of an enormous, 300-meter-wide crater. Covering the crater were countless interlocking golden threads, which were none other than the manifestation of the divine ability which came after the throat-crushing grasp and the mountain-shaking bash, the undying hex. It could seal anything and everything. At the bottom of the crater, the dust-covered Bai Xiaochun was struggling back to his feet, not sure whether to laugh or cry. He had forgotten that he was in a desert, and that there was only loose sand and dirt beneath his feet. To suddenly tumble down and end up covered in dirt right in the moment of triumph was definitely a loss of face, but after climbing out of the crater and confirming that no one was in the area to see him, he breathed a sigh of relief. Then he composed himself for a moment before transforming into a beam of light that shot back in the direction of the tavern. Moments after he left, cultivators from Sky City arrived to see what had caused the commotion. When they caught sight of the 300-meter-wide crater, all of them gasped in shock. This desert was put here by the Starry Sky Dao Polarity sect, wasn't it? No ordinary force could cause this kind of damage here. I can't believe someone actually managed to create a crater like this. Could it be that one of the famous chosen in the Starry Sky Dao Polarity superstars came down here to do some training? Not even core formation cultivators could do something like that. It must have been somebody from the top 1000 in the Starry Sky Dao Polarity superstars. When the subject of the Starry Sky Dao Polarity superstars came up, looks of envy could be seen on the faces of all the cultivators present. The Starry Sky Dao Polarity superstars were very important in the Starry Sky Dao Polarity sect. They were an elite group of cultivators under the nascent soul stage who were ranked according to power and ability. Anyone on that list could single-handedly shake the Eastern cultivation world. Even as the discussion about the matter unfolded, a beam of light appeared off in the distance, within which was a handsome young man. He seemed weary and travel-worn, but his eyes shone brightly, and astonishingly, his cultivation base was a step beyond the great circle of foundation establishment. He was in the quasi-core stage. A mere glance at him would confirm that by merely crystallizing his spiritual seas, he would step into core formation. Although there was always a possibility of failure, considering the fluctuations that rolled off of him, that didn't seem likely in his case. There was also a murderous aura surrounding the young man which, when coupled with the scars on his face, made him seem somewhat unapproachable. He was none other than Song Ke. Back when he had parted ways with Bai Xiaochun, he had immediately gone outside the sect to start working on missions. Lots of them. Nearly a year had passed, and he had faced many potentially fatal situations. However, he had gone all out to complete most of his missions, and had only a few more to go, all of them inside of the necropolis ruins. After accomplishing those missions, he would have a savings of tens of thousands of merit points. As he passed through the area, he noticed the crater, and couldn't help but stop to take a look. Whoever made this crater must be completely extraordinary. One of these days, I'm going to be just as incredible. The other cultivators looked at him warily. After all, the dangerous gleam in his eye, his murderous aura, and his generally sinister air made him seem like the type of person no one would dare to provoke. He seemed like the person who lived a life surrounded by death. When Song Ke noticed the looks of fear in their eyes, he was secretly pleased, and even a bit proud. He felt as if he had become a new person in the last year or so, and had become much more powerful. From what he could tell, he was just around the corner from becoming a yellow-robed disciple. I wouldn't be surprised if those other losers had starved to death by now. HMPH. In his arrogance, he couldn't help but muse that Master God Diviner, Shu Baosai, and Big Fatty Zhang were all completely useless. Only Chen Manyao had a bit of potential. Of course, the mere thought of Bai Xiaochun caused Song Ke to grind his teeth. Bai Xiaochun had crushed him for the first time in the Fallen Sword Abyss, stealing his chance to reach Heaven Dao Foundation establishment, and that was a source of constant angst, something he would never forget for the rest of his life. And then there were all the things which had occurred in the Bloodstream sect, which had nearly driven him crazy. Even how things had played out in the River-defying sect were almost beyond bearable. Bai Xiaochun, you made a fool of me in the Fallen Sword Abyss, twice as badly in the Bloodstream sect, and 3 times as badly in the River-defying sect. You just never shut up about care this and care that. You just wait until I become a yellow-robed disciple, then I'll make a fool of you 10 times worse than you ever did to me." As he spoke, his eyes began to shine even more brightly than before. He was completely and utterly confident that he could do exactly as he had planned. "The Starry Sky Tao Polarity Sect is a land of good fortune for me. Before coming here, the clan patriarch told me he had full confidence that I would become a nascent soul cultivator here." Looking down, he tapped his bag of holding to produce a blue command medallion. It wasn't large, but it was very significant. Earlier, when he was outside the sect on a mission, he had run into another cultivator from Sky City who had sold it to him for a hefty sum. It was none other than a command medallion which could be used to enter the necropolis ruins run by the Celestial Sky Society. Whether or not I get enough merit points to become a yellow-robed disciple will depend on how things go in these ruins. Hopefully, I'll come out with enough to get my promotion, and then I can ascend to the Rainbow District. Having reached this point in his train of thought, his eyes began to burn with passion and anticipation. "First, I'll go scout out the ruins a bit. Then I'll go make some special preparations to finish the missions." Smiling, he shot off in the direction of the necropolis entrance. Before long, he was closing in on the location, which was when he caught sight of a rather large tavern that had been erected around it. He also saw the outside seating area with the tented pavilions and cultivators bustling about wearing white garments that make them look like waiters. A lot of other ordinary disciples could also be seen going into and coming out of the ruins. Well, they certainly deserve to be known as the top organization in Sky City. Only the Celestial Sky Society with their Diva clan backers could build a tavern like this. He sighed, eyes gleaming with envy when he thought about how much income the Celestial Sky Society must be making by controlling the area. Sadly, there was nothing he could do about that. "I bet they make more in a day than I could save up in a year." He had spent the entire past year outside the sect working on missions, and thus had no idea about what had gone on in the city during that time. Sighing with envy, he produced his Celestial Sky Society medallion and headed toward the tavern. The ruins of the temple were very different from the rest of the desert. Right in the middle of them, a huge door could be seen, which was the entrance that led into the necropolis. Next to the ruins and the door was the Azure Dragon Society's tavern, and the bustling pavilions filled with countless cultivators. Some of them were calculating their earnings from inside the necropolis, others were finishing their cups of spirit tea before heading inside. The rules were actually a bit different from when the Celestial Sky Society ran the area. Although the Azure Dragon Society only collected 10% of the profits, they also required that anyone entering the necropolis purchase a 10 merit point cup of spirit tea first. Even with that new rule, they were being much kinder than the Celestial Sky Society, leaving the cultivators of Sky City very pleased. Of course, nothing could cause them to forget that they were on private property, which was threatening in and of itself. Furthermore, many frightening rumors had spread regarding Boss Azure Dragon, and nobody dared to do anything to offend him. As the hustle and bustle continued in the pavilions, Song Ke approached with a cold expression on his face and his murderous aura roiling. That was how he had grown used to carrying himself outside the sect. Generally speaking, it made it much easier to handle matters when he looked intimidating. Song Ke had no plans whatsoever to enter one of the pavilions, and instead headed straight toward the ruins with the intention of doing some scouting. However, one of the young Azure Dragon Society cultivators noticed that he was planning to bypass the pavilions, and quickly hurried over. Clasping hands and smiling, he politely said, "Hello, fellow Taoist, I'd like to invite you to come over and buy a cup of spirit tea." The courteous way that the Azure Dragon Society cultivators treated customers was a result of the rules put in place by Chen Manyao. After all, their being here was already a subject of envy, and despite having reduced prices, they still needed to treat customers courteously. At the same time, if anyone came along who didn't show them courtesy in return, the Azure Dragon Society would make sure they came to know that troublemakers weren't welcome. "Spirit tea?" Song Ke said, surprised. "I'm not buying any spirit tea." Although he wasn't pleased, when he thought about how powerful the Celestial Sky Society was in the city, he suppressed his irritation and flashed the command medallion. "See that? I have a command medallion." His tone of voice instantly attracted the attention of some of the other cultivators in the area, who looked over with strange expressions on their faces. The young man from the Azure Dragon Society didn't seem to be offended, and the smile never left his face. After taking over the location, the Azure Dragon Society had encountered other people like this who didn't know about the change in arrangements. Clasping hands again, the young man offered a kind explanation. I'm very sorry, fellow Taoist, but your command medallion is from the Celestial Sky Society, and they don't operate in this location anymore. We're the Azure Dragon Society, and things work differently under our control. With that, the young man patiently explained the rules, and as he did, Song Q's expression changed multiple times. He had spent a lot on that command medallion, all for the purpose of avoiding the 30% fee charged by the Celestial Sky Society. Now that he was being told that the command medallion was useless, Song Ke was nothing less than flabbergasted. How is this even possible? Song Ke said, the Celestial Sky Society is so powerful, you people. Song Ke was starting to get anxious. If it was really true that the command medallion was useless, that would be a big blow to his plan to be promoted to a yellow-robed disciple. By this point, Song Q's murderous aura was pulsing dangerously. He already had a short temper to begin with, and in his anxiety, his wording began to turn sharp. You people can't do this. This command medallion was extremely expensive. The cultivators in the area began to edge away, clearly amused by the scene which was playing out. There were even some cultivators in the crowd who secretly worked for the Celestial Sky Society and joined in to fan the flames. The Azure Dragon Society had better explain this. Yeah, that's right. I bought the same kind of command medallion for a pretty penny. Don't tell me it's completely useless now. The expression on the face of the young man from the Azure Dragon Society suddenly turned grim. Snorting coldly, he said, get the hell out of here. If you cause any more trouble, don't blame the Azure Dragon Society for being impolite. Song Ke had just faced a year of deadly danger, and his killing intent could erupt at the slightest provocation. Eyes flashing with cold light, he unleashed the power of his quasi-core cultivation base, causing a powerful wind to rush through the area as he took a step forward. The young man from the Azure Dragon Society looked shocked, and cries of astonishment rose up in the area. From the look of things, a huge commotion was about to break out. However, in that very moment, someone spoke in a quizzical voice. Song Ke? Master God Diviner and Shu Baosai had just been passing by, and when they looked over to see Song Ke, their jaws dropped. Song Ke had been bristling with a murderous aura, but when he caught sight of Master God Diviner and Shu Baosai, it changed to an expression of astonishment. That was especially the case because of the healthy glow they had, and the way all of the Azure Dragon Society cultivators in the area looked at them with expressions of reverent respect. You too. Something seemed off to Song Ke, but before he could react any further, Bai Xiaochun, who had heard the commotion and taken the time to straighten up his robes before stepping out, scanned the area with divine sense. Upon seeing Song Ke, he blinked a few times, and then smiled broadly and rushed out. As he appeared in the open, the numerous Azure Dragon Society cultivators looked at him with expressions of reverence as they dropped to their knees to kowtow. Greetings, boss. The reaction of the Azure Dragon Society cultivators caused a stir in the crowd. When people looked over and saw Bai Xiaochun, they gasped and rushed to clasp hands and bow their heads. Greetings, boss Azure Dragon. It only took a few moments for everyone in all of the pavilions to join in. As for Song Ke, he looked over at Bai Xiaochun, dumbfounded, his mind spinning and his eyes completely blank. Care, Bai Xiaochun cried, a loving expression on his face as he hurried over. You finally showed up. How did you get yourself in such a bad situation, Care? I mean, I thought I had it bad, but obviously, you have it way worse than me. When people heard Bai Xiaochun's words, more gasps could be heard, and then people looked over at Song Ke with envious looks. Considering that the boss of the Azure Dragon Society was addressing this cultivator as Care, it confirmed that the two of them had a very close relationship. Clearly, this Care was a generation below boss Azure Dragon when it came to family ranking. Song Q's face was as white as a sheet, and his mind was being battered by tsunamis of astonishment. He suddenly felt like the entire world had been turned upside down. Here Bai Xiaochun was, glittering with the light of magical treasures, numerous jade pendants hanging all over him. Even at a glance, it was obvious that he must be wearing more than 1 million merit points worth of ornamentation. In addition to that, he was flanked by more than a dozen puppet-made servants, each of whom had a leashed spirit creature with it. Their combined value had to be in the millions of merit points. Song Ke had spent an entire bitter year eating frugally and risking his life to reach the threshold of being a yellow-robed disciple. Now, he felt like he was about to fall to pieces mentally. Why, your boss Azure Dragon? He stammered. He felt like his vision was swimming, as if the sheer incredulity of the situation was more than he could process. As that happened, Big Fatty Zhang and Chen Manyao approached. Song Ke tore his vision from Bai Xiaochun to look at them, and when he saw the finery they wore, he suddenly got a very bad feeling. You guys. Shu Baosai cleared his throat and looked at Song Ke with an expression of pity and compassion. Song Ke, we own this place. The Junior Patriarch built the Azure Dragon Society into what it is today, and this tavern belongs to us. This whole area is the personal property of the Junior Patriarch. Your command medallion really doesn't do any good here. But considering that you're the Junior Patriarch's nephew, then we're all on the same team, right? Who cares about command medallions? Just toss that thing in the trash. You can go into the necropolis anytime you wish. Right, Junior Patriarch? Bai Xiaochun wore a very somber expression as he patted Song Q's shoulder. Looking very much like someone in the elder generation, he nodded his head. Care, your aunt entrusted your safety to me. As your senior, it's my responsibility to care for you. Despite how you callously abandoned me when we first got here, you're my nephew, so I can cut you some slack. Listen, those ruins are quite dangerous, and as your uncle, I really can't see you facing such peril. How many merit points do you need? I'll make up the difference, and you can become a yellow-robed disciple immediately. All it will take is a single word on my part. In response to his words, countless gasps could be heard in the area, and many covetous gazes fell upon Song Ke. Most people could only dream of becoming a yellow-robed disciple, and yet they had all personally heard Bai Xiaochun say that he could give that honor as a gift to Song Ke. The envy in their eyes couldn't have been more obvious. However, Song Ke was a proud person, so to hear terms such as uncle and Ke caused his anger to spike to the heavens. Blood sprayed out of his mouth, and then, unable to control himself, he passed out flat on his face. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.